I don't really identify as an evidence-based lifter. And I want to give some context for that because, if you had to make it a spectrum, right, between what you would typically call the evidence-based lifting end of the community and the bro science end of the community, well, I'm like 95% on the evidence-based side. But I still don't identify as an evidence-based lifter. And I think that's a really important distinction. So I want to give a little bit of context before I really dig into the argument of the thing, which is obviously that I've been around for a little while. My name is Adam. I am a fitness coach. I make video games. I'm a power lifter. Been lifting for 20 years, all that good stuff. But when I started coming up in the fitness industry, when I graduated university, first of all, I have a degree in English literature and philosophy, right? I am not a sports science, exercise science person. That just is what it is. And after I got out of university, didn't really have a lot of job prospects in my area, and I decided to get into fitness because it was something that I was passionate about. At that point, I had already been lifting very seriously for 6 or 7 years. Lifting had helped me to overcome depression and anxiety issues as a teenager, and I just really wanted to bring that to other people, right? I wanted to be an advocate for the beauty of lifting and exercise in general. And what happened was, at that time, around 2012, that's around the time that being evidence-based became sort of a big new concept, or, the thing that everyone was trying to be. And sort of the idea there is that, the old school way of doing things was basically a lot of, not making stuff up, but it was, obviously things were driven by, sort of charisma and sort of dogma, and, coaches would be like, oh yeah, like, my method is the best. And then somebody would come up with a completely different method and go, yeah, no, my method is the best. And that was kind of how things worked for a really long time. And yes, obviously, that is based in many cases in the coach's own experience and in various forms of evidence. But, sort of the real change, the shift, was that now people were really relying on the scientific research. And to be fair, this is around the time that a lot of scientific research started, becoming available for the first time. I would say that, as I've said in many other places, exercise science, sports science is relatively in its infancy as a discipline. And this was around the time that it became sort of fashionable or, big to be a part of that. And what this meant was basically just that you had a lot of people who were not just people who were jacked and strong, who, were really good at lifting, but also folks who had, masters, PhDs in exercise science, people who were talking about the latest studies, and people who are trying to really use scientific evidence as a basis for how we determine what the best kinds of training are. And this obviously sounded like, it's a really cool promise, right? It's a lot of like, okay, well, we used to think that X is good for you, and then we did a bunch of research, and it turns out that, actually Y is better. Or, like that you can see sort of the appeal there is being able to know the right way to train and having some objective evidence about how that works is really compelling. It makes you stand out as a coach, as a trainer. However, I think the real problem is that even back then, the reality is that most of the people in the quote-unquote evidence-based fitness community were not, I would say, particularly evidence-based. What I would say is that you had probably a handful of people who were genuinely people who were engaged with the science, so actual researchers or people whose job it was to sort of help interpret that research to a broader audience in a really intelligent way. And virtually everybody else in the quote-unquote evidence-based end of the fitness community was people like myself, to be quite fair. People who did not necessarily have any real, background in the science, who did not really know the science very well, who could not really read scientific papers very well, but who wanted to have that veneer of scientific authority. And it doesn't help also that there were a lot of people who would basically just sort of throw around studies that they didn't really read and didn't really understand as evidence for the things that they were saying. And to be fair, I include myself in that category quite strongly. People would go out and they would find some kind of study on PubMed that looked like it would agree with them based on basically just the headline and the abstract, and they would obviously not actually read the whole paper or really have any ability to understand and interpret scientific papers in general. And then they would say, oh, this paper says that stretching is good for you, therefore stretching is good for you, therefore, boom, evidence-based. And that became a huge problem because the misuse of science became a huge, huge issue around that time as well. And so while there was obviously the birth of this new sort of evidence-based segment of the fitness industry, there was also this, massive expansion in the amount of pseudoscience that gets thrown around in the industry as well. And to be fair, I can't speak about the way the industry was before I joined it, before I was really on the pulse of things. So I can't necessarily say that this is, necessarily always better or worse than what came before, right? But what I will say is that I, in particular, know that I made a lot of overconfident statements when I was younger, based exclusively on wanting to sound and seem evidence-based when I really wasn't, or when the things that I was saying wasn't. I was obviously trying to be evidence-based in a general sense, but I would make specific arguments that did not have any basis in evidence. And I think that what really happened is that this turned into a kind of enmity or a kind of rivalry between people on the internet who obviously don't identify as evidence-based, who sort of identify as being based on experience or based on, some prior tradition of understanding in the fitness industry, versus those people who talk specifically as if stuff always comes from the science. And I think very often that still gets very misused. And I think that leads to a lot of that enmity. Because when you frame everything as evidence-based, it's hard to say, like, hey, X amount of my opinions are evidence-based, but actually, all this other stuff outside of that is, totally just experience-based or based on something else, which is an inevitability because, again, this field is one that's relatively in its infancy. Yes, we have some good research in some areas, but there are a lot of areas where we don't have good research or research at all. And there are a lot of areas where it would be almost difficult or impossible to get good research just because of the way that is structured. An important thing, for example, is that we don't have a lot of research on elite athletes. And, why is that? It's because elite athletes do not want to sit down to have you mess with their training. They are not going to say, hey, I'm going to take 10 elite athletes and I'm going to make 5 of them do a training program that everyone knows is probably going to suck, and then one that might be, really good. No one's going to want to be in the group that, might suck. They're probably just going to drop out of the study, which is going to invalidate the study entirely, right? That is the age-old issue, is that we can't get a lot of good research on high-quality participants because we simply don't have participants willing to do those kinds of studies. And so because of that, when you frame yourself as evidence-based, it makes it hard to just be like, yeah, this part of my beliefs is evidence-based, this part of my beliefs is not, whatever. Very hard to sort of draw a line there. And then meanwhile, people who are, proudly not evidence-based, people who are proudly based on experience or whatever, they'll fight tooth and nail over that. They will go, oh yeah, like, you're not evidence-based, this isn't evidence, this doesn't have evidence to it. They will fight over every single potential interpretation of the science. And then there's also the fact that obviously also many of the people who are evidence-based or, quote-unquote evidence-based may not fully understand the science and may not really be able to converse about it very well themselves either. And that's really the crux of the issue, and why I would say I don't identify as evidence-based is not because I don't think that being evidence-based is good. It's not because I don't think that being evidence-based is probably the better way to do things. It is that I personally don't think I can live up to that standard. I genuinely don't believe that I can, because I myself have spent, I would say, the entirety of my adult career, the entirety of my lifting career since 2012, as somebody who engages with the evidence as much as I can. I follow a lot of the major evidence-based content creators. I'm really close friends with some of them. I work with some of them. I spend a lot of time engaging with the research to the extent that I can. I read a lot of Mass Research Review, which is a research review that was originally created by my friend Greg, which is a monthly publication which is designed to sort of interpret the research that's coming out to a broader audience. So make it more understandable so that you can read through it and you can sort of understand what actually the research says and what it doesn't, and sort of contextualize it in the wider body of literature. So I spend a lot of time engaging with the science, and even then, I would say that, to be quite fair, about 80-90% of it is stuff that obviously I understand and I interpret and I internalize. And then maybe 10% of it is stuff that's like, I don't know what any of this means. I'll be quite honest. Again, I have an English and philosophy degree. I do not have, necessarily the scientific understanding to really interpret this stuff. And that's fine, right? You don't need to necessarily always understand that remaining 10% to understand, okay, here's what the 90% of it says, and here's what that means, and here's what the practical takeaways are, and so on. But I struggle to call myself evidence-based because I don't even understand the science that's there really fully to any extent. And I also recognize, again, that the science that is there is so incomplete that it would be hard to really comprehensively call yourself evidence-based. I think that if you started out today and you had an actual degree and you were actually an academic in some sense, yes, you could call yourself evidence-based. I think maybe in, maybe 10, 20 years when we have a lot more research, maybe then, it will be more prudent to call yourself evidence-based in a general sense, even when you are not somebody like that. But I think that for the time being, even with the massive strides that exercise science has made in the past 10, 15, 20 years, it is very hard to continue to call yourself evidence-based. And that is really the crux of the issue. I just want to be honest. Again, I would say that in general, the evidence-based folks are a lot more correct than the non-evidence-based folks. But then this turns into also a lot of drama, like recent drama, where people want to argue about very minute details of things. And this is also a small gripe that I have with exercise science in general, which is that, to be fair, a lot of the people who are actually arguing about the exercise science of things, like, hey, is it better to have, 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight per day or 1.2 grams per pound of body weight per day? Is that going to maximize muscle growth more than 1 gram? Those kinds of arguments are very appropriate for academics to have. And they're very appropriate for those sorts of evidence-based folks to have, meaningful debates on. The problem is that sometimes these debates filter down to regular people, and then regular people argue about these numbers rather than going to the gym and lifting weights and eating protein and just ignoring it. I think that it tends to encourage a lot of folks to focus on the fine-tuned minutiae, the small details that don't really matter that much as a percentage of their overall results. And I think that that is a problem that is, not unique to exercise science. Like, everybody is like this in every field. Everybody likes to worry about small details that don't matter because these are the kinds of details that they can argue about and that are in front of them, and they have this sort of recency bias. I do think that one problem is that when exercise science-based folks have these sorts of arguments about these minute details, it makes the average everyday person think that these are the kinds of things that they should be worrying about, the kinds of things that they should be focusing their energy and time on, rather than, again, the important stuff. And I will emphasize again, the important stuff is you lift some weights, you do some cardio, you do that a few times a week, you do that repeatedly for 5 to 10 years, you eat a decent amount of protein, you eat decently healthy in terms of a decent amount of fiber, not eating too many calories, not eating too few calories. That is 80-90% of the fitness equation. That is the stuff that people should be focusing on, and they don't. And that is, again, like people arguing about exactly how many grams of protein they should have. Who cares? I think that a lot of people, and I think also this is very funny because this is also a way in which the non-evidence-based folks claim like, oh, I'm not evidence-based at all, but then they sort of parrot these arguments that the evidence-based folks are having, where they are sort of using the same terminology and the same methods. They're arguing about the same things that the evidence-based folks are saying, and they're saying, oh, these evidence-based folks are all pencil necks and whatnot. But I would say that the real pencil neck thing, genuinely, is like worrying about the exact number of grams of protein you should be having instead of just being like, yeah, I'm going to eat a bunch of food, I'm going to lift a bunch of weights and have fun with it. That's really the big thing at the end of the day, is like, a lot of people are missing the forest for the trees. And I think that includes very much the non-evidence-based folks as well. They also tend to get sucked into these arguments that don't really matter and are not really that important for them in the short term and in terms of the things that they should be focusing on to get results. In general, I think that evidence-based folks are more correct than not, especially when you sort of, filter out the folks who are pseudo evidence-based, which again can be hard to tell, and that's sort of part of the problem right now. I think that in general, a lot of the non-evidence-based folks who are taking issue with it are often being, I would say, not necessarily intellectually dishonest, but they just don't care sometimes. They just kind of want to win points in an argument, so they're not necessarily really trying to engage with the arguments of, sort of the evidence-based approach at times. And that's fine. The world goes round. But I myself would not call myself evidence-based, not because I don't think it's a worthwhile label to aspire to, but simply because I feel that I personally don't measure up to it. And I think that that's, just me being honest. That's just me being real with you folks. I am as evidence-based as I think it is possible for me to be. Unfortunately, I don't think that that falls into any real objective label. I certainly know that there's a lot of things, especially in my training, in the way that I train other folks, that has worked over the years that I don't know, it's there's not really any evidence base to this. There probably wouldn't really be any evidence base for this for a long time unless, they did some research specifically on the kinds of methods, the kinds of training that I do. So, that's fine. That is the reality of the situation. And I'll just add, my buddy Greg Knuckles did a bunch of books a while back that he called The Art of Lifting and the Science of Lifting. And I think that he really hit the nail on the head with that concept. Because yes, there is a science of lifting, but there is also an art to it. There is also a lot of stuff that is just totally not science-based. That is, I guess, what you could call the non-evidence-based, the experience, basis, the basis of tradition, the art of things. Which is that, yes, obviously, the science is important. It's always, important to rely on that science to tell you what works and what doesn't, to form as sort of the primary basis for your understanding. But then there's so much stuff outside of that, which does not fall into the science at all. That falls into art. And at that point, you kind of have to just make sure that you are developing your art around your science, if that makes sense. So, that is all for today's video. As always, don't hesitate to like, comment, subscribe, smash that notification bell, leave some hate comments down below. I did get some more hate comments in the last one. Thank you very much. You all feed me. Your hatred makes me more powerful, stronger. So, keep it coming. Have a good one, and I will talk to you all next time.